Today, France, political extremism, and the power of narrative. Your host is Rick Falkvinger, and this is Liberties Report.
This report is presented by Private Internet Access.
Good evening and welcome to Liberties Report Week 12, 2015. Three recent events in France have put the focus back on the power of narrative, the one thing at the core of the net's disruption. First, in France, we have a comedian who was satirizing Charlie Hebdo on Facebook and who was, as a result, found guilty of criminal speech in France. Second, a court in France has ruled that French courts, and not Facebook and not California courts, are to determine what's okay to post on Facebook. And this time it was a nude art piece, a piece that has been a centerpiece of discussion for art historians, so it's a fairly important piece, that Facebook deleted for nudity reasons. And yes, French art does tend to contain nudity. So here, France fights in favor of broader freedom of speech and expression than would otherwise be allowed. And third, a French law allowing wholesale censorship of websites without judicial oversight has come into effect, citing political extremism. But, as is usually the case, there's also a whole slew of rider adjectives attached to political extremism, riders that usually range from mere unpleasantness to the usual business competition against the incumbents. And even when these are not explicit in the law, they are usually embedded in grey areas surrounding vague definitions, like the completely arbitrary extremism that roughly translates into something the current regime disagrees with to a certain degree or more. So, the question here, is France expanding freedom of speech, or is France constricting it? It seems to do both at the same time, right? To understand this, we need to go back to the power of narrative and see how it changes with the net. In my keynotes, I sometimes do the thought experiment with the audience and ask them if they were the sole editors of a newspaper, or even the sole writers of a newspaper, the only newspaper in the entire world for a week, and anything they wrote in that newspaper would be taken for truth without question, what would they write in it? Most people think in terms of fame, think in terms of emboldening themselves, even enriching themselves, and that's thinking very small. Because if you were able to control the truth, if you were able to hold the power of narrative, you wouldn't need money again in your entire life. You would be a walking god among humankind, because you could say that you were. This is how important the power of narrative is. This is also when the printing press arrived. We've seen many parallels between the printing press and the net. This is also what Martin Luther challenged to the Catholic Church, their power of interpretation, which they were abusing. Again, the power of narrative. This power, the ability to dictate what is true and what is false, is the one greatest power that any human can have in a society of human beings. And this is also what changes with the net, just like it did with the printing press. This is why the old guard, the offline borns, are trying to literally control what you're allowed to think about, discuss, look for information about, and by extension, even think about. It is about the power of narrative. So then, why does France push for expanded freedom of speech in the nudity case? It's fairly simple, really. The idea of a naked person is not dangerous to their power of narrative. An image of a naked person cannot topple a regime. A naked person does not provide a new perspective that people haven't seen in the mirror before. It's the new perspectives that are dangerous, and they are spreading. France isn't alone in this counter-reaction against the net. In the UK, the Minister of the Interior, Theresa May, is outlawing non-violent extremism, as we reported on Liberties Report Week 40 of last year, 2014. This non-violent extremism is completely undefined. It's essentially communications of opinions that the government considers extremist. And again, that's non-violent extremism, with the huge grey areas of uncertainty here. And it's easy to believe that it's deliberate uncertainty. This is essentially a ban on dissent that becomes too powerful. The battle for the net and what it brings has only just begun. If the citizenry takes control of this technology, we'll see a society that's more transparent and more inclusive than has ever been seen in the history of humankind. If a self-selected elite takes control of it, we are going to see a dystopic society that's far beyond the nightmares of the novels of the 1950s. That battle stands here and now. I'm Rick Falkfinger, and this is Liberties Report. Visit our sponsor, Private Internet Access. Good night.
This report is presented by Private Internet Access.
Liberties Report is produced using exclusively free software.